This is an encounter that I cannot explain. In fact, you could say that I have covered my tracks because there are those out there that live in fear of me revealing what I saw. My family has lived in Florida since the late 1940s when my grandfather retired from the Army Air Corps and built a great life for himself. He thrived in this particular area of the state with plenty of fishing and hunting. Now, years later, I'm 51 years old and I'm a married father to 3 boys. Like my grandfather, we too enjoy hunting and fishing. I'm a communications worker and I finally got a weekend off to enjoy some rest and relaxation at the family lake house. I was traveling east from Tampa Bay in my pickup truck, pulling my airboat. I decided to get fuel in Lithia, L-I-T-H-I-A, Lithia. I was 50 miles away from my destination. It was cloudy during the summertime storm and I took the back roads, which meant I lost only 30 minutes, making it a scenic drive. I felt the right rear tire on my boat trailer go off the shoulder, and I soon realized that I had had a blowout. I pulled over near the gate to a state park. Luckily, the lake house was only a few miles away. There was a large black SUV with tinted windows parked nearby, and I couldn't tell if it was occupied or not. As I changed my tire, a large man sporting a ponytail appeared behind my trailer. A second man, about my size, a little stocky but with a slight beer belly, emerged from the SUV and approached me. With my eye on the man still lurking behind my trailer, I asked if they needed some help. He told me that they had an airboat broken down on the lake's edge and had the parts to repair it, but they could use a lift. The man offered to pay me, but being a good guy and fellow boater, I refused his money. We were joined by a third man who was carrying twin duffel bags and a plastic tote. He threw everything into my truck, and I drove all of us to the nearest boat launch. Once we were in the water, I asked for a GPS location. The man with the beer belly said that he would direct me, adding that he knew the area, but there was a lot of swamp in the way, and that we'd have to run the sloughs near private property. We came upon a fence line where the man asked me to idle the boat. Then he asked the location of the pump house. Well, I pointed behind the tree line, although it occurred to me if he really knew the area, wouldn't he know where the pump house was? One of the others silently directed me to kill the engine. I began to think my good deed had put me in danger. There was no broke-down boat in sight. I was with 3 men whose manner suggested drug smuggling. I began to wonder if the duffel bags and the tote they'd brought aboard held some kind of illegal substance. One of the men pulled what looked like a drone from inside a plastic tote. There was a camera attached, and the man took a minute to adjust the monitor on his iPhone. The others unzipped the duffel bags and began putting together assault rifles. After the drone went airborne, they donned night vision goggles and slid into the shallow water one at a time, their weapons above their heads as they sloshed toward the shore. "What the hell's going on?" I hissed, trying to keep my voice low. "Is this legal?" "It's all good," he promised. "As soon as you hear me signal, crank up the engine and be ready to gun it out of here." Well, I was starting to panic. A few hours ago, I was just another weekend slacker with nothing but beer and fishing in my plans. And now, I was the getaway driver for a bunch of wannabe hitmen that, for all I knew, were committing murder somewhere out there in the dark near my lake house. Suddenly, I heard something, and I looked up into the night sky and saw a fireball arc gracefully over my head and hit the water a few feet from the boat. I flashed my light toward the surface and saw what was left of a drone before its mangled propellers sank underwater. And then there were a series of automatic rifle bursts and men yelling, and I heard tall grass rustling and tree branches breaking. "Hit the engine!" I heard the voice. 2 of the men came into view and dove into the water as I cranked the engine. They scrambled onto the boat, but before I could ask about the third, I heard his screams coming from mid-air as he went flying 20 feet beyond us and hit the water with a mighty splash. "Leave him," said one of the men. "Get us out of here now." I pivoted the boat toward the man who was flailing in the water as if he couldn't swim, and I gripped his right arm to pull him aboard as he howled in pain. I realized his arm was broken. The others did help me get him into the boat. Something whizzed by my head and landed on the deck. It was an assault rifle, the muzzle bent like a pretzel. I piloted that boat like a madman until we reached the launch. The others climbed from the boat and they stumbled into the truck while I reloaded my boat onto my trailer. They didn't say a word as I drove them back to their SUV. "Let me help you wrap your buddy's arm," I offered. "We'll take care of him," snapped one of the men from the back seat as he helped his injured companion out of my truck into their vehicle. The last to exit opened the passenger door. "What I mentioned earlier, we need to settle up," he said. "Look, I don't need anything from you," I responded, thinking that this guy getting the hell out of my life would be payment enough. And suddenly his hand went for my throat. "Not a word of this to anyone," he said. Well, I stared long and hard at his face until he let me go, and he kept his eyes locked with mine as he climbed out of the truck, slamming the door with enough force to underscore his threat. From my rear view mirror, I watched him collect what was left of their supplies from the boat. He walked up to my back bumper, and he looked down, and he reeled off a series of numbers. It was my license plate. He winked at me and walked back to the SUV, and I watched their taillights fade into the night. It was unsettling. Instead of the lake house, I drove the 95 miles back home. I did what I was told, and I didn't tell a soul about that night. In general, I behaved as if in witness protection. It didn't stop me from thinking about what happened, though. With their beer bellies and ponytails, I suspected the three men were not part of any professional militia. At any rate, a good soldier would not leave a battle buddy to drown with a broken arm. Whatever they tussled with out there in the wilderness, it was savage enough to give them the beating of their lives, but human enough not to kill them. What you're listening to are archived stories that I've done over the last 5 years. I'm reaching way back to some of the first ones I ever did. I'm repurposing and re-editing and cleaning up the audio on stories from when I had no idea what I was doing with this audio. And I'm releasing all of these on the podcast app. Over the last 70 days, I've released one podcast a day. For 70 days. Now, they're not all available now because like 65 is dropping tomorrow. 66 will be Saturday or Sunday, but there's one every day. If you'd like to hear that, if you're new to the channel and you'd like to go listen to some other stories that you don't feel like going back to on YouTube, you can subscribe to my podcast on Spreaker or wherever you get your podcast. Do a search for What If It's True Podcast, Dixie Cryptid. It'll be right up there at the top. I've got over 400 podcasts up there. Some of those podcasts are not on YouTube. They're exclusive to the podcast only. Anyway, this video is a compilation of archives 1 through 5. It's about an hour and a half long. I'm not going to talk anymore. I just want to let y'all know what this is. If you've heard these, skip the video. But if you're new to the channel and you haven't gone back and listened to these, this is a good way for you to listen to them. And I will release these about once every 2 months, like I don't know, in September, October, I'll put out Best of Dixie number 14. There'll be 5 more episodes that are on the podcast right now. You can listen to them right now, but that's what I'm doing. So hope you guys enjoy this. All right, here we go. I grew up on a 40-acre sand and rock farm in Oklahoma. I'm 74 years old now, but back when I was 12, I got a job driving a tractor during the hay harvest at 25 cents an hour. Now that may not sound like much now, but my allowance was 25 cents a week, so it was a windfall for me. Plus, riding in a tractor all day was far less work than the chores I had to do at the farm. I would cut, rake, and bale for 10 or 12 hours at a time. Well, that added up to $3 on most days. To me, that was a fortune. My boss offered lunch to his workers, but he charged a quarter for a jam sandwich. Now, a jam sandwich was a piece of bologna jammed between two pieces of bread, and we were lucky he didn't charge for the water. The season was coming to an end with wet weather on the horizon and a quarter of the field still on the ground. My boss wanted it cut and raked and baled and in the barn before the rain hit the next morning. So he asked me if I'd stay until the job was finished. I was tired to the toenails, but it meant more money, so I said yes. By midnight, everyone else was headed home. My boss usually picked me up each morning and dropped me off at the day's end, but he was overly tired, and I suspected that he may have tipped a few throughout the day. He asked if I could walk home that night. "It's just a couple of miles," he said. "Keep the moon over your shoulder and you'll be fine." Neither of us remembered the river and the marsh that lay between me and the house, and besides, I was young, and it didn't seem like a big problem to me. The moon was full and bright as I entered the woods. The storm was still in the distance, but occasional bolts of lightning flickered on the horizon to remind me that it was getting close. It had been 2 hours, and I was beginning to cuss my boss and the swamp and my life in general. I'd kept the moon over my shoulder like my boss had said to do, but I was lost. Mostly I thought about my grandmother. I knew she would be sitting on the front porch waiting for me and worried to death. My granny was a little old lady who never used rough words and rarely raised her voice unless she was provoked. When that happened, she was a force to be reckoned with. Once, I not so accidentally shot her in the backside with my BB gun. That was not a good day for either of us. The wind was picking up and singing in the treetops with the approaching storm. I was working my way out of a deeper pool that I'd stumbled into when I heard something that sounded like more than just wind. Staring into the dark abyss that was the swamp, I saw what I thought must be a mountain lion sitting on a large stump. In those days of ignorant, indestructible youth, I reacted to fear with anger, and I knelt down and searched out for a stout stick. Ignoring whatever slick-scale creature slithered away from under my fingertips, I found one and I raised it over my head. "Come on, you son of a bitch," I screamed in defiance. "I'll knock your dang head off." When I looked again, the cat was gone. The wind rose up and howled some more, and I kept moving. When it died down again, and I heard that sound that wasn't wind, ahead of me in a small moonlit clearing, I could see a shadow darker than the other standing tall and bulky. Its eyes glowed in the moonlight. My grandmother's warnings of haints and boogers rang in my ears. I'd never paid much heed to those warnings before. I knew haints were ghosts, but she'd never described a booger to me. I had assumed it was all the overactive superstition of an old lady anyway, but now I wasn't so sure. Thinking it was better to be safe than sorry, I started toward where I thought home was. I'd like to say that I was too smart to run, but that would be a lie. I was too tired. All I could muster was a fast mosey. I didn't know if that thing was behind me, if it was even following me, and if it was catching up with me, or what it would do to me if it did catch me. I only knew I wanted to get home. I swam the river and staggered up onto the opposite bank, and feeling the exhaustion in my legs were like lead weights. There was no stopping, though, and I didn't know where that thing was, and I pushed on. A while later, I found myself on the highway a couple of miles from home, too exhausted now to take another step, and I stood there staring in the direction I wanted to be, listening for that strange sound that wasn't the wind, and looking like something that had been dragged out of the swamp when a farmer pulled up in his old truck. "You need a ride, boy?" he asked. I was too dirty to ride in the front with him, but he let me climb in the back and drop me off on the road in front of our mailbox. My grandmother was in her chair on the front porch with a cup of coffee in her hand and a fair-sized switch leaning against the wall. and with my last bit of energy, I opened the side gate and made my way to the porch as she called, "Where you been, boy?" I explained about the last of the hay and the approaching storm. I told her how my boss had said if I kept the moon over my shoulder, I'd find my way home. I told her how I got lost anyway. She sent me out to the pump house to clean up while she made biscuits and gravy. I guess I didn't do too good of a job cleaning up because after we ate, she sent me to the screened inside porch to sleep in a guest bed. A few hours later, I awoke to the sound of a ruckus in the drive, and peeking out, I saw my grandmother shaking her finger under the boss man's nose as she read him the riot act. "You darn idiot! A grown man and you don't realize the moon don't hang still in the sky? You ain't so big or so old that I won't wear out a switch on you." My boss kept his eyes on his boots. It was a good thing to stare at when Granny was on a rant. In the winter of 1999, I was in a relationship and living with my girlfriend near the Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota. She was half Chippewa on her mother's side, and she wanted to spend the winter close to her mother. If it weren't for the excellent fishing and the best snowmobile riding trails, I would have broken up with her to move back to Texas. I'd been living about 15 minutes south of Belcourt, the Turtle Mountain Reservation, for about 6 months, so I only had a handful of buddies, one of which lived about 35 miles in Dunseth. Dunseth is about 20 miles west of Belcourt, so some nights I would ride my snowmobile through Belcourt to get there. I would either ride around those areas or head north to another hick town in Canada, where some of the bars still honored the drinking laws that allowed for 18-year-olds to be served. One day when it was still light out, but getting dark around 5 p.m., I was headed to Dunseth to meet up with my buddy on my snowmobile. We'd just gotten a fresh powder after a blizzard. My machine didn't have a res tag, so I was bypassing Belcourt to avoid being harassed by the reservation cops. That whole area was dotted with lakes that in the winter became salt flats for snowmobiles. I had a Ski-Doo Formula 600 with every modification and upgrade available. It was like a ninja in the snow. On this particular day, I was following a summer 4x4 trail that circled the lake. It was a wide trail in summer, but in the winter, especially after a blizzard, there was barely room enough for one snowmobile to get through. The trail curved to the right and followed the lake cove and dropped in elevation. I was flying down the path when I saw that it was going to intersect with another one about 500 yards away at the lake bank. I had every intention of really opening up once I hit that frozen lake. I could also see what I thought were a couple of moose on the trail ahead. I hit the gas thinking it would push them onto the lake. There have been times when I've gotten really close to deer that way. As I reached the point where the two trails met the lake, I couldn't see the moose anymore, and I thought they must have climbed up the side of the trail. I blasted past that point and got hit by an avalanche. I felt my machine's suspension bottom out. If I hadn't been wearing a helmet that kept my head from being crushed against my tank, I think I would have been hurt pretty bad. I've been doing about 35 miles an hour at that point of impact, and I almost flipped the machine. And as it was, I managed to come to a stop about 30 yards onto the lake. I was overcome with a stench that smelled like heavy of urine. Looking back, I expected to see a moose, but that wasn't what was standing there. It stood up and screamed long, loud sounds that was almost like a dog's yelp. It was reddish-brown like Chewbacca from Star Wars and covered in hair that was 6 to 10 inches long, and it was really skinny. It reminded me of a teenager whose head, hands, and height were still way ahead of his build, or how a puppy looks real lanky. I could even see ice balls on its hair like snow dogs get. Its face was black, but his eyes were blacker and sort of beady looking. It was 7 feet tall, but it definitely didn't look fully grown. It looked emaciated. The smell was horrible. I worked maintenance in an apartment complex a few years ago, and there was a dirty hoarder whose apartment smelled almost the same. It made me gag. Oh, God. I see those hoarder shows, and I think, I would hate to go in that place. But anyway, here we go. Let's keep going with the story. The scream it made wasn't like a roar most people say they hear. It was a scream of shock and fear. He got his point across, and it was like he was saying, what the hell just happened? And maybe wanted to laugh because he thought it was funny. I was kind of in shock and trying to keep my machine running, but it stalled out. We stared at each other for another 20 or 30 seconds until I remembered I had a revolver in the front pocket of my backpack. I carried it in case I broke down and had to deal with wolves or drunken reservation boys who wanted to harass an outsider. I was trying to reach that gun when I remembered he wasn't the only one I'd seen. I felt a bad vibe coming from the trees behind him and thought it must be his family group. It was like they knew I was reaching for a gun. I felt dread and fear like I had never felt before. I got my machine going and I got out of there as fast as I could. When I got to my buddy's house, he was outside waiting for me. He must have heard me coming down his drive doing 70 or 80 miles an hour and sliding into a snow pile next to his driveway. He looked at my sled and saw the damage to the hood, and I explained what had happened, and he laughed, saying, "You're lucky they didn't kill you and eat you." We decided to arm ourselves, being careful to put the weapons where they'd be easier to reach if we needed them, and we went back to the point of that impact. There was a lot of hair and urine and some really big tracks, but they were gone. I wasn't about to follow their tracks into the woods that night, so I grabbed my plastic windshield that had fallen off the hood, and we went back to my buddy's house. Later, I found a bunch of hair stuck in the cracked hood as well, and I saved it, but my girlfriend's mother told me it was a dog man that I'd hit, and it was just bad juju to keep it, so I burned it. I don't believe I hit a dog man, though. I think this was a Bigfoot, a teenage Bigfoot. I also don't think it meant me any harm. It just fell off the bank as it was scrambling to get away before I passed by. I also think they can read your mind. It did mine. If you see one, please don't shoot it. If these things have feelings and personalities, then they're just trying to survive just like us. They are real, and one day someone is going to prove it. Back when I worked in the oil refineries in New Orleans, I met a man named Kevin. We got to be pretty good friends, and this is the story he told me. When he was 10 years old, he was put into foster care. He never said why, but he liked the man and woman who took him in. They weren't mean, and nor did they expect him to do a lot of hard work. They both worked outside of the home, so that meant that Kevin spent a lot of time at home alone in the summer. Back then, a parent could do that without worrying. When he was out exploring, he found a lake beyond the woods that were behind their house. He went home and told his foster parents about it, and they told him that he could go back there and play all he wanted. He was even allowed to swim in the lake as long as he wore a life vest. And to a young boy like Kevin, that must have been paradise. The next chance he got, Kevin headed back to the lake with his life vest in tow. And when he got there, he was surprised to discover a boy and a girl already playing in the water. As soon as they saw Kevin, though, they ran into the woods and hid. Well, Kevin shrugged his shoulders and he went about his business. Weren't no skin off of his nose if those kids didn't want to play with him anyway. There was a grapevine hanging from a tree that Kevin got a hold of and swung himself out over the water. And he dropped in with a big splash and had a great time. Then he climbed out and he did it again. And off in the distance, he could see those two kids watching him. Clearly, they wanted to come back and join him, but they seemed like they were a little afraid to do it. As Kevin swung out for the third time, he motioned for the two kids to come back and join him. That was all it took. And soon, Kevin and his new two friends were playing around in the water like lifetime buddies. Kevin wasn't blind to differences between him and the other two kids. For one thing, they were completely covered in hair and they didn't wear swimsuits. And since they were playing in chest deep water, that fact didn't matter much, but it did seem odd to Kevin. And he also noticed that they were clearly foreigners. They didn't speak a word of English. They managed to communicate just fine, though, by grunting and pointing, so that didn't matter much either. That night, Kevin couldn't wait to tell his foster mother about the kids that he had met at the lake. She asked what the kids looked like, and he said they were dark. He also explained about the language barrier. Louise, his foster mother, was happy that he had found some new playmates and that they were able to be friends despite not being able to speak the same language. Several weeks went by, during which Kevin played almost daily in the lake with his new friends. They never learned to speak English, and he never learned to speak their language, but it didn't keep them from having a lot of fun. And then one day, Louise got off of work early and decided to walk down to the lake to check on Kevin. As soon as she came into view, Kevin's friends ran off into the woods. Well, he called after them, but they didn't answer. He would have run after them, but Louise prevented him from doing that. "Are those your friends?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "Yeah, that's them. I don't know why they ran off like that," Kevin said. Louise put her hands on his shoulders then and leaned down so she could look him square in the eye before saying, "Kevin, honey, them ain't children. They's boogers." Kevin didn't understand what she was trying to tell him. "What's a booger?" Seeing the confusion on his face, Louise tried again. "Sweetie, them is monsters." "Monsters?" Kevin exclaimed. "What do you mean, monsters?" "Well, for instance, they don't sleep in a house. They sleep out in the woods, and they don't wear clothes because they're all covered in hair." Kevin couldn't argue that last part. He had often wondered about their situation. He couldn't help himself, though. His eyes slipped into the shadows where his friends had disappeared. They didn't seem like monsters to him at all. He liked his friends. And then Louise said one last thing. "I don't want to talk about it anymore, and I don't want you going down there near them. Do you hear me? To do so is to bring on bad luck." And with that, she and Kevin returned to the house. Kevin didn't sleep that night. He had a lot to think about. His friends had never hurt him. He knew they were weird, but they were his friends. And he didn't want that to change, and he decided that he wouldn't tell Louise about meeting them at the lake again. And what she didn't know wouldn't hurt her. Ultimately, he didn't have any choice in the matter. He went back to the lake every day for the rest of that summer, but the little boy and girl who had been his closest companions for months, they never came back. Meanwhile, Louise and her husband took on 2 more boys. They weren't quite as easy to handle as Kevin. They weren't troublesome kids, but they had their own set of issues. Tim, who was the older of the 2, tried to get into bed with his foster parents on several occasions. It got so bad that they had to start locking their door. But that didn't keep him in his own bed, and when he found the door locked, he curled up in a ball and slept on the floor in front of it like a cat. The younger one was named Mickey, and he had his own issues. Several times he would wet the bed. And it wasn't an every night occurrence, and it wasn't a problem that he brought with him. They didn't have an indoor toilet out where their house was, and when the other 2 boys came to live with them, neither Mickey nor Tim had issues with grabbing a flashlight and walking the path from the kitchen door to the outhouse at the edge of the woods. And then one day, for reasons no one could understand, Mickey started wetting the bed at night. Time passed, and Kevin grew up. He went his way, and Tim and Mickey went their own ways. But they all kept in touch with their foster parents, but none of them was especially good at keeping in contact with each other. That's how it is sometimes. A few years before Kevin told me this story, his foster father passed away. It was the first time he had seen his foster brother in years. There was no animosity between them, so it was only natural that the 3 found themselves sitting together at the wake and talking over old times out there on the farm with their foster parents. As with all funerals, there were some tears mixed with laughter and a lot of reminiscing and a few could-have-beens and maybe nots. They'd been talking for quite a bit when Mickey hesitantly asked a question. It was obvious that he wanted to ask it for quite some time, but he was struggling to find the right words. Have you ever, he started, and then realizing that that wasn't the right track, he began again with, when you were out there, did you... Again, he wasn't sure he was wording the question right, so he paused, but before he could find another way, Tim said, weird stuff? Kevin and Mickey were both stunned into silence. Kevin thought immediately of his swimming buddies, but he couldn't imagine what the other two could be talking about. Weird things, Mickey corrected. Yeah, weird things, agreed Tim. But Kevin didn't speak. Something in the back of his mind was telling him that his foster brothers were not going to share swimming stories. I never wet the bed before we came there to live, Mickey said. Well, I mean, not since I was a toddler anyway. He gave each of the others a long look before going on, as if to say, go ahead, challenge me. When neither Kevin nor Tim said a word, he continued. I mean, it wasn't like I enjoyed traipsing out to the outhouse in the middle of the night, but I didn't mind it either. He looked down at the glass in his hand. It was a drink someone had handed him earlier, like he didn't know what to do with the empty drink. I kind of thought it was like a big adventure, like Indiana Jones kind of stuff. It was a bad analogy, and Mickey knew it. The Indiana Jones movies didn't come along until well after they were grown. He shrugged that off and he continued. There was this one night when it was storming. It hadn't started raining yet, but man, was it lightning and thundering wicked. Well, I was walking to the outhouse when one really bright bolt of lightning lit up the sky like stadium lights at a Friday night football game. And it was close, too, because the crack that came with it was almost immediate. Again, he stared into the cup, not wanting to make eye contact with Tim or Kevin. Well, I looked up and then Mickey shifted his head and formed the words with his mouth, but no sound came out. A single piece of ice was trapped in the bottom of that cup, and he spun it around like a tiny race car on a plastic track. And after several seconds, Tim said, You saw it, didn't you? Mickey's eyes moved up to meet Tim's. I take it you did too, he asked. Yeah, it was tall and covered in hair, face right out of a nightmare. No one spoke, and although Kevin knew his swimming buddies weren't scary to look at, he had long suspected that they would have been by the time they grew up. He watched Tim now, knowing that he would share his story too. You know how I used to sleep outside of the folks' bedroom at night? Tim asked. Kevin and Mickey nodded. That thing used to look in my window. My bed was right there beside the window, except for a thin pane of glass between us. I could have reached out and touched it. It came and looked in the window all the time. Tim and Mickey traded descriptions and recalled their emotions for several minutes while Kevin listened. And when they finally exhausted themselves, he told his story. And then he told them how Louise had called them boogers and monsters and said not to speak to them because it would bring bad luck. The three left the funeral that day promising to keep in touch and feeling a little happier for having shared their stories with each other. Louise was happy to have them together and made them all promise to come and see her again soon. Kevin did one better. He bought some land nearby and had it cleared so he could build a house there. And once the building began, he saw Bigfoot several times. It didn't surprise him at all. The lake where he had swam as a kid made up nearly half of his property. They never came too near, but Kevin found himself wondering if he had disturbed their home and if they were upset with him for having done so. It turned out that Kevin had a co-worker who held Bigfoot weekends on a regular basis, so he figured it would be safe to open up and talk about his own encounters. The man was intrigued, and he offered Kevin money to allow him to host his Bigfoot weekends on that land. Guys were paying him $400 to come out and drink beer and help themselves to his fireplace stew while he told stories. And in turn, Kevin learned about the elusive creatures. He started leaving apples in various places in the woods, and when he came back, those apples were always gone. One weekend, he decided to tell the others what he had been doing, and while this spurred some debate, it was also a catalyst that sent everyone out into the woods to try and get a glimpse of some Bigfoot. One guy saw movement, and he quickly shined his light in that direction, and he was shocked to see that there were two of them standing there. Either out of instinct or fear, or maybe he was in a full-bore panic, the man pulled his gun and he shot one of them. They unleashed an angry growl and began moving through the woods, tearing through the trees and screaming. Everyone was so scared that they all ran for their vehicles. As the guy who fired his gun jumped into his, a tree fell on the car. He didn't get away. Well, that weekend changed everything for Kevin. The Bigfoot were bolder now, and they were angry, and they came up to the house at night and slammed the walls, and sometimes they'd break out windows. Kevin built a safe room inside the house that he could get into and lock himself inside if they ever managed to get inside the house, and when they tore down a door and he had to test the strength of that room, he knew it was time to move. After that, the property sat empty for the most part. It was sold a couple of times and families would move in, but they never stayed for long. That didn't matter to Kevin. He wasn't going back there. He told me that he understood now what Louise meant when she wanted him to stay away from them. He didn't think they were automatically monsters, but he did think that if anything could bring out a monster in them, it would be a human being. And once that happened, your luck really does run out. Growing up in the East Valley in Arizona, I spent a lot of my time in the desert. My dad taught us a lot about the dangers of hiking in the desert while searching for geodes and camping in the Sonoran Desert. You learn to keep your head on a swivel. It gets hot in the valley during the summer, and the hottest I experienced was 125 degrees Fahrenheit. To beat the heat, this past summer we went on a family camping trip in the Sitgreaves, Sitgreaves National Forest in northeast Arizona. Y'all, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce some of these places, but it's just who I am. I've never seen that word in my life, so I'm just taking a shot at it. I had never camped on the 260 by the lakes before. There were 3 adults, my mom, my brother, and me, along with 2 teens. We got a late start, so we didn't get to the rim until late. We drove past all the paid campsites and we turned down the next Forest Service road. 2 miles later, we came upon a dispersed camping site with fire rings. We drove until the road was blocked off and we found our spot, and the closest campers were a mile away. Within 30 minutes to set up our camp before dark, we sent the kids off to find firewood while we set up camp. And I noticed all the trees had orange tags on them, which meant that we couldn't set up tents beyond those. As soon as my 11-year-old nephew got out of the car, he went into King Kong routine, hitting his fists against his chest and banging branches against trees. I asked him not to do that because we didn't know what was in the woods and we didn't want to attract something, and I promised we'd survey in the morning and see what was around. As soon as we had arrived, my brother got sick, so he spent most of the time in his tent. The rest of us settled in and we ate our campfire meal. When the kids went to bed, leaving just Mom and me to soak in the quiet and stare into the campfire, we weren't as far from society as we would have liked. Mom's phone kept getting notifications. Sometime between 8:30 and 9, I started to hear whooping. I sat there listening and trying to identify what animal could make this noise. It would stay in the same spot for a while and then it would move. This went on for hours. It was still whooping when we went to sleep. The next morning, the boys were anxious to hike and adventure in the woods. My brother was still sick, so I took them to hike the small canyon behind our tents. Right away, I noticed all the tree trunks on the ground. A lot of them were pointing north by northwest. There were a lot of tall ferns, and I looked for an animal trail to follow, but there were none, so we ventured on through the ferns. On the other side, I noticed old tracks from a small bear and told the boys that we needed to move. We cut through and went to the opposite from where we'd started, and the whole area was the size of a football field. The boys discovered a cave on this side, and they claimed the territory to explore. And afterwards, we went back to camp, and we enjoyed the day. My nephew continued to knock branches against trees, and when I asked him why he was doing that, he said, "Something's knocking in the woods, and I'm just knocking back." Well, I told him not to wander off too far. Later that day, we went on another hike where the road had been barricaded off to drivers. We walked down the hill and came upon a beautiful valley. I noticed something off in the woods. It was a big, round, long piece of metal. We have flash floods here, so I figured it was something used to direct the flow of water elsewhere. However, it was a strange place for it to be, and we took in the scenery and snapped a few pictures, and we went back toward camp. We saw 2 cow elks not far from camp, so I decided I'd go hiking on my own to see how close I could get to them. I'm small and light-footed, and as a kid, I made it a game to sneak up on people and surprise them. So I wanted to sneak up and get a picture of these elk. On I crept, being as quiet as I could, and I got within 150 feet of them when they heard something. They took off to my right, and then they looked back at me. I had my phone out and my camera ready, so I turned to my right and I got a quick picture. Meanwhile, the elk stopped and went back to eating. A few minutes later, they looked up again and they ran off. I assumed I had made too much noise for them. I had claimed an area as my spot, and I headed in that direction. There was a tree there that I had come across while out exploring. It was unusual, but not naturally so. It had been manipulated to look the way it did. I had originally thought it was a Native American live directory sign. However, the Native Americans hadn't been in this area since the cavalry chased them out. This tree was young, and the arch in it would take time to create. A snare trap wouldn't do that. And besides, it would have had to have been placed there for quite a while to achieve the shape. There was also a nice boulder there to lie on and admire the canopy and the view of the little canyon. However, I began to get the feeling that I was being watched, so I headed back to camp. I took a lot of pictures as I went, while the lighting was right. Several of those pictures I took behind me because I really felt like something was there. I never felt threatened, I just knew something was there, and I wanted it to know that I knew it was there. We started the fire early, and we ate before the sun went down, and then we all sat around the fire for a while before the boys and my brother all went to bed. It was just Mom and me again, and I put a pile of wood on the fire and went to change into my night clothes while she took pictures of the blazing fire. While I was digging through my bag, I heard the clanking of a truck pulling a trailer as it hit potholes on another dirt road leading to the lake. The Mom yelled and asked if I'd heard that. She spooks real easily. I only take about 30% of her spooks seriously, so I yelled back at her and told her that it was just a truck pulling a trailer. I continued to pull my things out of my bag until I heard boulders shifting in the canyon behind my tent. It was coming from near the caves where the boys had played all day. I dressed and I sat there listening for a minute as the boulders continued to shift. I went out and I told my mother about the boulders I'd heard while I'd added more wood to the fire. And meanwhile, she pulled out her flashlight and she began looking into the woods. Something was moving. It had glowing eyes. That was enough for us. We woke my brother to get him to shoot off around in that direction. And at first, he thought we were overreacting, and I reminded him that I've spent a night out in the desert being stalked by a mountain lion. I wouldn't wake him up if it was nothing, I told him. Well, he grumbled, but he grabbed his gun and he came out, And that's when he saw the eyes too. They were peeking over the edge of a rock like it had ducked down. He fired the gun at the eyes and they disappeared. And in my experience, a bear or a lion would have run off. He went back to bed and we stayed up. I added more wood to the fire and sat down in my chair to stare into it and to listen to the sounds of the night. However, Mom's nerves were shot and she was on edge. She began to clean up what little mess we had made, and then out of nowhere she shined her light into the woods once again. And I assured her that we'd scared off whatever was out there, but she said, "No, Crystal, something is still there." I hadn't heard anything but complete silence up until this point. I finally got her to settle, and then I saw the eyes again. They were big, round, glowing eyes staring at us, and I couldn't believe how far apart the eyes were set or how round they were. From a distance, it appeared to be at eye level with us. I was amazed at how it had circled the camp to get to the other side without making a sound. I wrote it off as a mountain lion at the worst, but their eyes were almond-shaped and they were set farther apart than a lion. Then I thought, maybe it's a bear, but again the eye shape wasn't right, and they would have been closer together. My brother must have been still awake, and he came out with the gun again, and he held the light on this creature, and he shot right at it. That's when it stood up. It was so tall, it was at least 7 or 8 feet tall. It didn't even flinch or try to run away. It just stood there staring at us intensely. At this point, we were all spooked, so we went into one tent together. The boys didn't have any trouble falling asleep, but Mom and I were wide awake now. We laid there in the silence for what felt like forever, but there were no noises outside, and all we could hear was the wind in the trees and blowing against the tent. The last time I checked my watch, it was 2:30 a.m. before I finally fell asleep. At 5:27 a.m., we were all awakened by the sound of a dog barking. It wasn't an ordinary bark, though. It was like a cross between a coyote cackle and a dog bark. It was the strangest bark I'd ever heard, and as soon as we all got up and started moving around, the barking stopped. Later that morning, I went out to do my morning business, and that's where I finally saw tracks. They weren't bear tracks and they weren't lion tracks, and it was not a little critter or a hoofed animal. These tracks were wide, bare feet that measured 4 hands in length and 2/5 in width. It had circled my bathroom spot. I saw where the tracks had come up the hillside from the little canyon. There was a boulder there that I would sit on and have a smoke when I wanted to get away from the family. This totally amazed me, and there were more tracks around, but they were smaller. I went back to camp and told everyone what I found. They all wanted to see it too, and my brother was as amazed as I was. He'd been in this rim many times, but he'd never seen anything like this. To say the least, we were a little freaked out, so we decided to cut our Monday to Thursday camping trip short on Tuesday morning. We heard knocking the whole time we packed up, and my nephew continued to knock back. When I went back to my spot to change into cleaner clothes, I took whatever this thing was, a small bouquet of flowers and grass. Some change fell out of my pocket as I was changing, so I left a dime or two and some pennies, and I propped up a piece of wood facing north by northwest. I left camp and went to the lake to fish like we'd planned, and afterwards we went home. I've never experienced anything like this. It was quiet the whole time with very few critters around. Usually I see a lot of squirrels out there. I will camp there again, but not with the children. After 35 years of living in metropolitan Portland, Oregon, I moved in late 2006 to a tiny incorporated town of Springdale, Washington. The population there is 294. It's about an hour northwest of Spokane. I began a job doing community development planning and grant writing for the Northwestern Indian tribes. In the early summer of 2007, I was driving home from work. I had just left the Spokane Indian Reservation, heading north on a country road that is the eastern boundary of the reservation. Along the east side of that road is a steep embankment, and looking down, I spotted a small Sasquatch. It was maybe 4 feet tall. It had scraggly and dusty-looking charcoal hair that was about 4 inches long. It had wide shoulders like a human and no visible tail or ears. I couldn't determine if it was a male or a female. I saw it only in profile as it stepped forward, nearly on all fours. I never got a glimpse of its face. When I asked my coworkers the next day about Sasquatch sightings, I was told that they were not uncommon, but were more often seen in the western side of the reservation, that bordered there by the Columbia River. The Ute Indian grandmother, with whom I became friends in Springdale, shared with me that she and her grandson, who attended elementary school, had seen a Sasquatch a couple of years earlier as they entered the town from the east. It crossed the road in front of their car in an area dotted with a few houses in the woods. Now, they claimed it was carrying a full green trash bag over its shoulder, as if it had just raided a garbage can. Well, while in Springdale, I began following Sasquatch reports and discussions on YouTube. I particularly enjoyed hearing Kumbo's encounters and information sharing, David Pilata's Sasquatch and Missing 411 stories, and Wes Germer's Sasquatch Chronicles. I realized I had a loose connection after hearing Germer's own riveting encounter near Yacolt, Washington. So as a planner, I used to drive there to help the town develop public works grant applications. In 2016, I moved back to the west side of the Cascade Mountains, this time in the backwoods of Washington, west of Mount St. Helens, a place rich with recorded reports of Sasquatch sightings. My highway area is partially forested but with open fields and scattered homes, and I have always thought it likely that there were Sasquatch frequenting this area. But one night, in the wee hours, I was sitting in my living room watching a free YouTube movie. I was suddenly startled by an awful crashing sound that shook my house. I could hear metal being bent and twisted, and I thought something was happening with the vent to my kitchen range. There was a noise so loud that it caused me to envision my kitchen cabinets falling off the wall. I checked around my house and I found nothing but a mirror that had come loose, and it had not broken. I decided that multiple tree limbs must have landed on my roof, and I planned to check the damage the next morning. I'm 74 years old and my vision is poor, so I phoned a neighbor and she came over to check the roof with me, but she saw no fallen limbs. But what I did find was that the decorative little wash basin I keep filled with large seashells had 5 of them removed and arranged in a perfect semicircle. I asked the neighbor if anyone had reported strange goings-on recently. Apparently, an elderly woman to the east of my house was awakened the night before by something repeatedly hitting the back wall of her house. I decided that I would camp out in my utility room with the back door propped open and see if my unruly visitor returned. Well, that night it was cold and uncomfortable and scary, so I gave up after about an hour. A few mornings later, however, shells were being removed from the tub and arranged in a semicircle again. The shells became a running theme, ending up in various places around my home, arranged in the same similar pattern. I wondered if my Sasquatch friend had a flair for decorating. Perhaps it was meant as something sinister, a calling card for future violence. The fall rains have arrived and it's been quiet. I really do not want to be face to face with a Sasquatch. U.S. indigenous tribes believe there's strong evidence that shows the cryptid to be a human hybrid and not an animal, and as such, I will likely be looking over my shoulder as I garden in the spring. I'm a Vietnam veteran from Clarksburg, West Virginia, and my story happened in Gandy, West Virginia. I come from a family that taught you to hunt at a very early age. Hunting was one of the main sources of food for most families in those days. I spent most of my childhood running through the woods for fun. I helped start a Boy Scout troop in my area. During the campouts, the boys and scoutmasters would play tag. It could get pretty brutal with the adults and the older boys giving out Charlie horses and shoulder punches when they tagged you. So a friend and I decided to escape and go into the woods. We climbed a big rock formation and we hid out. The rock formation was pretty high up and we could see the camp, while the others had no clue where we were. In the darkness behind me, I thought I heard heavy breathing and the sound of something walking toward us. I counted off the seconds between each step, and I could tell that not only was it large in size, but likely something standing upright. I thought maybe it was a bear. We never saw whatever it was because it freaked us out. We got out of there and preferring to face off with our scoutmasters than whatever was lingering out there in the dark. As an adult, I've been back there several times to trout fish. There's an awesome stream that runs through the area, and a lot of scouts from those days remain fishing buddies. But in Gandy, every time I've been there, no matter how many friends and family tag along, I always get that feeling that I'm being watched. In 1980, my ex-wife's grandfather, Bill, and his son, Johnny, asked if I wanted to go fishing in Gandy. Well, I didn't have to work, and it was going to be a beautiful weekend, so naturally I was all in. The place was packed with people, so we struggled to find a decent spot to camp. We decided on a small valley nestled between two mountains. The place was a little grown up with tall grass and strewn with fallen trees. You could tell it wasn't used often. It had a creepy feeling about it, the way it was lit up in the moonlight that night, but it had firewood in a huge fire pit. The stream wasn't but 100 yards behind our camp. The dirt road we drove in on was about 30 yards from the tent, and we had just fixed a little something to eat right before Bill and Johnny turned in for the night. I started putting a few pieces of wood on the fire when out came this cry from beyond hell. It sounded like a woman being murdered and then morphed into a lion growling and howling. I heard Bill yell from inside the tent, "What was that?" This huge hickory tree, at least 4 feet in diameter and 150 feet tall, started swaying back and forth like something had gripped the trunk and was trying to shake apples down from a branch. It was across the road, 40 feet deep into the woods, just out of the reach of my flashlight beam. Bill claimed the only thing that could shake a tree like that was a bull elephant. He needlessly added that we didn't have any animals like that in West Virginia. The campfire, by now, was a raging inferno, because while all this was going on, I was throwing any kind of wood I could get my hands on to make sure that fire stayed nuclear. We didn't have any weapons on us. Bill and Johnny never came out of that tent while I stood guard outside all night long. Finally, when daylight came, the danger seemed to have passed, and I went over to see if there were tracks near the tree. The bark, about 15 feet from the ground, was all ripped off with claw marks about 1.5 inches deep into the tree. I placed my hand over them and I couldn't open my fingers that far apart. There wasn't a track to be seen. We ate breakfast and I went fishing, and when I came back into camp around noon, Bill had everything packed up and he was itching to leave. Back then I had never heard of Bigfoot or the Patterson-Gimlin film. But it hit me about 2 weeks later when Bill was watching a Bigfoot documentary, and in the soundtrack I heard the same sort of noises similar to that we heard in Gandy. Now I know a cat or a bear couldn't make those sounds or do that kind of damage to a massive old hickory tree. I am of Aboriginal descent and I have hunted all my life. A friend and I decided to search for a new area to track moose and deer. And we both live in Prince George and we know all the areas within 50 miles or so, but we had the itch to go see some new country. We hooked the Jeep to the back of the motorhome, and off we went toward the mountains and Pine Pass. We found a perfect spot just off Highway 97, 18 miles south of Chetwynd. It was noon when we disconnected the Jeep and immediately drove up the older trail to see where it would take us. To our surprise, the road was in pretty decent shape as we immediately started to climb up the mountain. We came to several awesome clear cuts that allowed us to see in all directions. We were in the middle of one of these clear cuts and decided to hide the Jeep back in the heavily forested area and walk to a good vantage point that was in the middle of the clearing. We were sitting on a knoll that was about 12 feet above the skidder trail, which we could see through the willows. We figured that we would enjoy a couple of sandwiches and didn't really expect to come across anything unusual as we had driven through with the Jeep 20 minutes earlier. It was a beautiful day, and we were sitting with our backs to each other, me watching the downhill and my partner watching the uphill. The grade was 10 to 12% and with small willows not blocking our vantage point, and we could see 500 yards in all directions. 4 massive bucks came out of a patch of trees that were only 150 yards on the downhill side. Well, that was a good sign, and since it was the day before the season opened, we headed back to set up camp, and we decided that we would walk to the same spot in the morning. We set out before daylight because we figured it would take us an hour to get there on foot. I have to admit that this was a bit unnerving for me because I like to see my surroundings when I'm in grizzly country. But nevertheless, off we went. My partner had done this night walk hundreds of times, and he said that we would be fine. He was such a nice guy that if we happened to come across a grizzly in the dark, he was going to trip me and get the hell out of there. He didn't get the chuckle out of me that he was expecting. Anyway, we arrived about 20 minutes before shooting light, and we just sat there and listened to all of nature's sounds. Now, this next part is very important, and it needs to be explained. There was no way in hell that even a coyote could be in the vicinity without one of us spotting it. There was nowhere for an animal to hide unless they were crouched within the same small clump of trees that the bucks had emerged from the day before. It was an uneventful first few hours, and it was now approaching the same time of day that we had initially seen those deer. There wasn't much wind except for a slight breeze from time to time. I had just remarked to my buddy about how quiet it was, when all at once I could hear a high-pitched buzzing sound, and I thought it might just be my ears ringing. The best way to describe the sound was as if someone had put a tuning fork to my head. I looked over to my buddy, and he said he could hear it too. On the skidder trail, right below us, appeared a dark shape that we could see through the willows. There was literally no way that this thing could have walked up on us because we could see 90% of the terrain all around us. It had hair rather than fur, and then all at once it stood up on 2 legs and it was staring right at us. Now, that freaked me out, and my buddy with the cooler head warned me not to shoot but to take the safety off and be ready. This thing stared at us for what seemed like an eternity but was probably only seconds. It dropped back down on all fours, and it let out a scream, and it shook us to our core. We should have caught a visual 20 feet down the skidder trail, but clearly it had serious stealth going for it. The high-pitched sound was hitting our eardrums again as we sat there for another hour, concerned that we had not seen it leave the area. We knew it was still close, and being ambushed was on both of our minds. The stalemate drug on until my buddy finally said that he was going to walk down to the skidder trail and have a look. Well, I was terrified, and I was about to see my friend get torn up right in front of me. It only took him a minute or two before he shouted to me to help him estimate how tall this thing was by raising one end of his gun up in the air. His arm sockets were straining as he held the weapon above his head. We guessed the beast appeared to be at least 10 feet tall, judging by my buddy's sore rotator cuffs. I've heard stories over the years about Sasquatch and always blew them off as folklore. Whatever this thing was, it had somehow eluded us and vacated the premises. I was shook by my experience and I chose to leave. On the ride home, my buddy told me about several encounters he'd had with Sasquatch over the years, and based on his well-worn travel tales, I assumed that they must be everywhere. When he invited me out into the wilderness for another overnighter, I declined. I couldn't bring myself to get back out there. He tried to convince me that sightings are few and far between and that the Sasquatch would rather be left alone. It's why he warned me off from shooting my gun at it that day. After letting the encounter simmer in my head for a few weeks, I let my buddy talk me into another hunting trip. He thought facing my fears by going out to the same general area would be good for me psychologically. I was nervous as hell while we were there, but after bagging 2 really nice muleys and an immature bull, I started feeling like my old self. It's always mystified me how the thing I saw that day managed to vanish without us viewing its escape. Some think they travel through portals or that the high-pitched ringing we heard was something to do with their ability to teleport. I don't know if I believe that. It doesn't make me feel any better knowing that these things can appear wherever and whenever they want. I don't want to stop going out into the bush, so I'll continue on as I've always done. I can't remember what time of year it was, but judging by the scenery and what I was doing, it must have been the end of summer or the cusp of autumn. I can be confident that I was on one of the longer school holidays children are given, much to the dismay of parents everywhere, because my girlfriend of the time had been sent to stay with her nan in a small market town almost 20 miles away from where we lived. Her mom and dad diligently limited our time together. We were young teenagers full of eagerness to act on our own natural drives, and they had good reason. When I received a written message from my girlfriend, cell phones were not a thing yet, letting me know that she was not under the watchful eye of her parents, a 20-mile bike ride didn't seem like much of a barrier to some alone time. Children had more freedom back then. I had more than most, being the 5th of 6 children. My parents had most likely had enough of parenting by the time it came to me and my little sister. My independent nature and my ability to stay out of trouble meant the arrangement was agreeable for everyone concerned. So with a backpack containing a sleeping bag and a change of clothes, I headed off to visit my girlfriend. England is a relatively small place, lined with narrow lanes and dotted over with farmhouses and small villages. There's always a place to stop and have a bite to eat. There isn't much there to pose a danger to a bicyclist or a hiker, except perhaps stinging nettle. That'll give you an itchy rash for an hour or so. But otherwise, I didn't feel as though I had anything to worry about as I made my way cross-country to the village of Bungay. The 20 miles seemed to pass quickly as I rode through the landscape that had changed very little since the days when the Romans ruled Britain. And soon I found myself on a country road too narrow for 2 cars to pass, and it was separated from a farmer's fence by an overgrown grass verge enveloped in cow parsley, blunt-leaf dock, and the chalky stems of yellow fennel. Norfolk is exceptionally flat, and so I was given an unhindered view of the sunset from the moment it touched the horizon until it slipped quietly behind it. And to my right, the world was all shadows and silhouettes outlined against the sun. And to my left, the fields were reflecting the amber rays and casting a sinister pall over the countryside. While I was wishing I had a camera, I slowed down to enjoy the sight, and that's when I became aware of a metallic sound. I think I had been hearing it for a while, but had subconsciously put it down to something caught in the spokes of my bike. Now, as I slowed, the soft metallic clanking had not changed. I looked back over the flat landscape, but I couldn't find anything, natural or otherwise, that could have been making that sound. Unfortunately, I had recently read Algernon Blackwood's The Wendigo, and though it held very little resemblance to what we are told today that what a Wendigo looks like, it is one of the few books I've read that truly scared me. That, combined with my natural fear of dark and time of day and my location far from any man-made light, sent fear sweeping over me in the form of panic. With a mental image of the Wendigo rising up from behind the overgrown fence line and sprinting at me with ungodly speed, I pushed off with steely determination to reach the well-lit safety of my girlfriend's Nan's brick home. As I raced along in the fading light, the metallic sound stayed with me, and in a very short period it changed from clanking to that of a dog's claws on the pavement. I was hoping that was the case, and I looked back half expecting to see a dog like my German Shepherd at home, ambling down the road behind me, but again there was nothing in sight. I'm deaf in one ear, and as such, I'm used to being misled by sound. Identifying it or placing its distance and direction are much more difficult with only one good ear. But still, this was a familiar noise, whether I was able to identify the source or not. The absence of sunlight was doing nothing to counteract the chill that had swept over me, but the knowledge that it was a sound I knew helped to provide some calm. As if to punish me for relaxing, the sound of something big came from the long grass and tall plants on the verge. The dry sound of moving grass and folding stems softened the clank of a short chain being dragged over the hidden fence. I whipped my head around, expecting to see an animal that I thought had come out of the field and should have been standing on the verge behind me, but nothing was there. An electric prickle slid up my back and raised the hair off my neck. The road was empty, but I saw the silhouette of a pair of long, narrow dog ears keeping pace with me in the field. The animal's head wasn't bobbing, so I knew it didn't have to try to keep up with me. I could see the top of its head in the breaks of the tall grass, and it seemed to know I was looking at it because it folded its ears and ducked its head lower. That chilled prickle made a home in the center of my chest, and it tightened my lungs and made the air hit cold in the back of my throat. My heart started thumping against my rib cage as if it wanted to break out of its organic prison, and it pushed icy blood around my body, and instinctively I knew the situation was unnatural. My legs were already pumping as hard as my heart while my head swiveled between the narrow road ahead and the animal moving along the fence. If I'd seen the thing's head level with the tops of the grass, it had to be 5 feet tall. Now that I knew what I was looking at and where it was, I could see its thick, heavy muzzle and long black body between the thinner patches of the grass. Somehow, I found more speed, but that didn't help. It increased its gait to trot and keep pace with me. I was pelting along faster than I'd ever biked before or since, and all this dog had to do to keep up was trot. Fear was pushing me beyond my limits, and the voice of reason was a distant whisper in my mind, between telling me it was just a horse or a deer, but I knew in reality it was an unnatural creature and I had no chance of escaping. An animal that size could leap over the fence and catch me if it wanted to, and there was nothing I could do to stop that. I could hear the animal's paws padding through the dirt and the rhythmic jangling of a chain as it lazily started to close the gap between us. On the very few occasions when I had been forced to cede control of my body to the fight or flight response, I had been amazed at the number of tiny details that autopilot is able to pick up on and factor into a snap decision. And even now I can clearly picture the vista ahead of me as I approached the small humpback bridge spanning a narrow stream with 3-foot deep banks flanking it. And although I couldn't see the road immediately beyond the hump of the bridge, I could see the hedgerows bordering the generous gardens of scatterings of cottages built along the winding road. There was a slight downward gradient that probably passes as a hill around here, and it allowed me to see the roof of a car weaving its way toward the bridge at a speed. The homes in sight were all on the right side with open fields on the left. And that meant the dog wouldn't have any overgrown grass to stay behind after it crossed the stream. And thinking that the dog would choose to pounce on me after clearing the end of the bridge, I dug deep and pushed out enough effort to increase my speed a fraction as I crested the humpback bridge. As my tires left the tarmac where it was gouged by unwary drivers who had bottomed out, I saw that the road took a sharp turn to the left, a little beyond the foot of the bridge. I cleared most of it and landed already leaning hard to the right to make the turn, and happy that it would take me further away from the dog. But as I rounded the corner, I saw a large, unreasonably spiky piece of farm equipment sitting by a large gate that opened out onto the fields. Still in mid-turn, I remembered there was also a car coming fast that, in all probability, hadn't seen me coming over the hump of the bridge, and if I stayed on the road, I would be hit by the car. And if I kept pulling left to get off the road, I'd be secured on the blue crescent-shaped steel spikes belonging to the tractor trailer. And to the right, I saw a well-kept privet hedge belonging to the first cottage along this road. Although I hadn't glanced back since I had noticed the deep gouges in the tarmac at the crest of the bridge, I imagined the large dog running alongside me just on the other side of the manicured hedge. I had nothing to do with the choice made. It was all instinct, and I jerked the handlebars to the left and tensed my arms and shoulders as a wall of green hiding the field's boundary hurtled toward me. Before I hit anything, the front wheel snapped around beyond 90 degrees and I was catapulted off the saddle. In the air, I made contact with something hard enough to bounce off and tumble along the verge before coming to rest uncomfortably on my overstuffed pack. I sat up just in time to see the car going by and braking hard for the bridge. And given all the details I can recall from that moment, it vexes me to no end that I cannot recall the color of that car. The big dark face opposite me that had pushed itself through the hedge across the narrow road, however, will stay with me forever. With my legs splayed out in front of me, I felt the stiff stems of the tall grass between my fingers as I propped myself upright. I could have reached out and grabbed the painted blue spikes of the trailer beside me if I wanted to use it to haul myself off the ground, but I was locked in place by the gaze of an unnaturally large dog. Yellow eyes glimmered at me with their own luminescence in the half-light, and a heavy muzzle that wouldn't look out of place on a mastiff barely concealed the bulge of hidden fangs. Atop its large square head, two long, narrow ears were trained on me along with its unblinking gaze. I could see one leg planted firmly under its massive body, and I'm glad its paws were lost in the slightly overgrown edges of the cottage's lawn, because I think even a hint of tooth or claws would have pushed me to the breaking point. A heavy, coal-black chain hung beside the one leg that I could see, but I couldn't honestly say I saw much more of the animal. Hot tears welled up in my eyes as the bumps and bruises I got from the tumble began to ache, and I thought it was the end of me. At that moment, the giant dog, not 10 meters away from me, started to shrink. As if my encounter didn't sound unbelievable already, I promise you, the dog stood statue still and began to shrink. I know it doesn't make much sense to say this, but the shrinking didn't look real. It looked like a bad special effect from a cheap TV show as it got smaller. Well, I didn't move at all. It wasn't getting further away. It shrank and somehow it became wrong. I know that it is an incredibly poor descriptive, but the comparison to low-budget TV show effects is the best I can muster for what I saw that evening. In a scant few seconds, I couldn't see the dog anymore. An instinct relinquished control of my body. And I sat there for a while trying to normalize my breathing and stop trembling, And all too soon the growing darkness encouraged me to make haste to where my girlfriend was staying. I chose not to tell her what had happened. I told her that I had fallen off my bike and there was no need to worry. She was used to seeing me looking weather-worn and road-weary. After a mug of tea and a generous slice of cake, I all but forgot about the dog and concentrated on enjoying my girlfriend's company. And all too soon my girlfriend's nan politely reminded me that it was getting too late for a young lady to have a male visitor. Fortunately, my return trip was mundane. Not much time passed before I put my encounter down to my fear of the dark feeding my imagination. I decided it was a deer that had startled me. Maybe something did stick its head through the hedge and stare at me, but a lot of people keep goats. They're great at slipping out of their pens or off their chains. But it wasn't until the internet took off many years later that I came across the story of the black Shuck, and I began to entertain the idea that I could have seen a supernatural hound. The United Kingdom has plenty of mythological creatures to call upon, a wealth of homegrown legends mixed with those brought to our tiny island by raiders and conquerors over the millennia. We are small, but we're not densely populated, and even so, what we refer to as a vast open space might only constitute a large backyard in other countries. That's why I raise an eyebrow whenever someone insists the UK has its own large cryptid running about. What I can start to believe is the many black dog stories that have been around since time immemorial, and the big cat sightings that have been common since the 1970s. Black dog stories have been a mainstay of legends and myths from Scotland to Wales and across the Irish Sea to Ireland. The town of Burnby has its own tale of a black dog called the Black Shuck, and it stretches back to the 4th of August, 1577, when darkness, rain, hail, and lightning, as was never seen the like, sent the townspeople to the church to pray for a reprieve from the tempest. Lightning struck the church, and a black dog broke down the door. With a bestial hatred and a disregard for God, all down the church in the midst of fire, the hellish monster flew, and passing onward to the choir, he many people slew. After killing 2 people, the dog of death, burning with the wrathful head of hellfire, vanished. It then apparently traveled 12 miles to the Holy Trinity Church in Blyborough, where it killed more of the faithful. St. Mary's Church has a tower damaged by lightning that now sports an iron weather vane with a black dog running on a lightning bolt. The Holy Trinity Church at Blyborough has burn marks on its ancient doors that were apparently left behind by the baleful heat of the Black Shuck's claws. Thanks to a little research, I have discovered many people all over Suffolk and Norfolk and the Black Shuck stories to tell. A good handful of them recount hearing a dog padding along the road close by and dragging a chain, but there is no dog to be seen. Those that do see something report sizes from a normal dog to something like a small pony, and a couple of people even say they watch the dog shrink and then vanish. The legend of the Black Shuck claims that if you see the dog, you will die within a year. Well, I'm fine, and so was everyone else that reported seeing the Black Shuck. But just like me, many of those people had a brush with death. If I hadn't been pedaling hard to get away from the dog following me, I would have come over the humpback bridge without seeing that car coming, and I would have been hit by it or veered off the road straight into the spiky tractor trailer. Perhaps then, the Black Shuck is there to protect the lonely wanderer on East Anglia's back roads and in its woods. If not, then it is a sinister harbinger of pending disaster waiting for our soul's release from its mortal vessel. Still an escort, but a shepherd of a very different kind. It has a chain around its neck, so that makes me think this dog is domesticated. The dogs are called man's best friends for countless very good reasons. And I can't help but wonder about that chain, though. If the black shuck is a domesticated animal, what sort of creature does a giant black dog call master?